Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Politics. Yes, that's right. In 2020, we're making a run for a new president of the United States or perhaps a re-election of the one that's currently in office. Certainly, as many of us have been bound by our homes and watching the news as we have very little or else to do being in lockdown from COVID-19, we began to wake up to a lot of the things that perhaps we weren't paying attention to or maybe not even interested in the first place, such as unmasking of those who thrive in the dark corner of the Department of Justice, as well as their political overseers who use their power and influence to usurp our legal protections. The lawless offers the most explorations of government corruption, investing in theft of trillions of U.S. dollars, says our guest today, as we find out about money laundered in countries that are hostile to the United States. Our guest today is going to be joining us with evidence to investigate and prosecute more than 1,000 high-ranking government employees, bankers, and politicians to show that the level of arrogance and contempt our political leaders hold for the American people is boundless. Our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today was a career banker and entrepreneur who spent 3 years investigating the Department of Justice while working with the FBI, U.S. attorneys, Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as U.S. intelligence agencies. His book is Capitol Hill's Criminal Underground. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Richard Lawless. Richard, thank you for being on the program today.
Oh, Daniel, it's an honor to be here with you and your listeners.
You know, it's pretty exciting. Earlier in the year, I had this wonderful guest on the program, and she was more like a natural healer, I guess, someone, helping people to develop strength and spirit and so forth. And she was talking about how she felt in her predictions that we're going to be seeing a lot of this stuff just sort of surface. And she said something very profound. She says, that's why this is 2020, the year. And it just hit me like, wow. And boy, we sure have had a lot of it, haven't we?
We have, and it's just overwhelming, the amount of malfeasance and corruption that's taking place within our government.
Mm-hmm. Well, you look like, for instance, just recently where you see Judicial Watch was on track to have Hillary Clinton testify in front of the House committee on her emails, and a judge just simply, in appeals, just says, nah, we're not going to do that anymore. You're starting to wonder about things like the Durham investigation. Will this all lead to anything anymore? Or the judge that's getting in the way of course, I'm trying to think of the general now, General Flynn, and how he's tying all that up. And you look at this and go, where is justice anymore for anybody? And your story is wonderfully compelling because of how you came to be entrenched in all this in the first place.
Oh, it's amazing and shocking, and the swamp is deep and endless. Even if you take someone like Durham, he started his career with President Obama and Hillary Clinton and the Attorney General at that time. And he owes a lot of his success to those folks. I just don't believe that that connection is going to allow him to properly prosecute or investigate anything that's going on without violating his loyalty to those folks, the very same folks who made his career.
Absolutely. Now let's go ahead and start with your story and how this all came about, that you seen just how infested the swamp really is, where it goes, and what was going on there.
You're not going to believe this story.
Well, as I was reading it, one thing I do believe was the first name on the hit list in the beginning of the book, one Chuck Schumer. I was like, oh boy. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, he's my godfather of a mafia-run operation here. But I'm just a regular blue-collar kind of guy, and I spent 30 years in banking, doing significant corporate lending, which is very similar to forensic accounting. You look at the company's past performance, figure out where the cash flows came from and what they were used for, and you make a risk-based decision on whether or not you're going to lend money. And after I finished my career there, I started a company called Commercial Solar Power, and our mandate was to build large renewable power plants for utility companies. And we got off to a pretty successful start and had almost $1 billion in pending business that we were working on. And we made the tragic error of securing a contract with the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, which is the largest government-owned utility in North America and Latin America. It's a huge utility, and it has complete dominance over the Puerto Rico market. There are no competitors. And they were highly dependent on oil and quite outdated in terms of their technology, and it was a perfect fit for us, and we were pretty excited about what we had to offer them and their clients. Long and short of it is the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority is just a criminal organization. It is run by local politicians who steal hundreds of millions of dollars out of the utility every year to benefit themselves and their family members. And it's not run like a proper utility company would be, like a Tennessee Power Authority or Con Edison or Southern California Electric. It's run very much like a mafia organization where everybody in the throes of power in the company has some sort of graft going on. And we weren't aware of that, and we invested significant amounts of money with them to start construction on this utility project, only to come to find out that they had really no interest in following through on the contracts they issued to build these. And the reason for that was they were embezzling a ton of money from their oil purchases. Instead of buying normal oil, high-grade oil, they were buying crude oil. They were buying polluted, toxic crude oil from Venezuela, but paying them for high-quality oil, a price difference of almost 55%, and many billions of dollars a year in sales. So the numbers are staggering in terms of what they were stealing from the company by selling all this, by buying all this polluted oil and paying for good quality oil. That money would be laundered in South America and then find its way back to powerful politicians and policing authorities to make sure that the scam could continue. So the biggest expense for Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority was their oil purchases every year, and it ran a couple of $1 billion a year, with half of that billing being totally fraudulent and ending up in the pockets of powerful politicians and other people. And when I found out about that, I started to write articles about it in local newspapers. In fact, there was my articles were printed in over 50 papers nationwide and in Latin America, and in many major papers and websites, the Daily Caller, Daily Signal, New York Observer, Denver Post, you name it. And all of a sudden I started to get phone calls, unsolicited phone calls, from people who identified themselves as whistleblowers with the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Justice, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And they were telling me that, look, I've been reading your newspaper articles, Richard, but you are just hitting the tip of the iceberg with this. And as time went on, they started to lead me in different directions. And I found out that what we were looking at is a mafia-style protection racket being run by our most senior senators in Washington. And what they would basically do is that they would put in their political appointees who run all these critical institutions, the Department of Justice, Securities and Exchange Commission, and as long as they received significant pieces of the stolen money as campaign contributions, they would make sure that there were no investigations or prosecutions of the criminal acts.
You know, when you take a look at this and you hear the word whistleblower, I think most people might consider, well, that seems encouraging, but you know, as I was reading in your book and what you also see there, they almost seem like this almost silenced majority or even minority, however you want to put it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is. And the problem with that is that the very same corrupt politicians like Chuck Schumer and others control their careers. and they're in a catch-22. It's illegal for them to disclose information that relates to these crimes, and if they do, they put their pensions at risk. And it's an incredible operation that would make the mafia blush. Chuck Schumer alone raised $110 million over 8 years from the very same firms that stole billions from American citizens, and they were never investigated or prosecuted. And these intelligence agencies, the CIA agents I spoke with, and the FBI agents I spoke with, are flabbergasted, frustrated, and furious that the Department of Justice, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission is run by so many corrupt political appointees that prevent them from doing their job and protecting the American people. I don't know if you know this, but your readers will love to hear this, and that is this came onto the radar, this activity came onto the CIA's radar about 8 or 10 years ago when they started to notice large wire transfers leaving Puerto Rico and going to Venezuela. So they started to tape record the phone conversations between the parties in Venezuela and Puerto Rico. And in those conversations, they identify senior Department of Justice officials, their family members, senior senators that are all getting a piece of this action. And they have 10 years of recorded phone conversations, and they've offered those recordings to the Department of Justice over a dozen times, and they denied the request.
I remember when I first sort of woke up to this whole, I'll just call it scam, for lack of a better word, was I came across a documentary, and it was about Jamaica. And what it was when you go to Jamaica, as a tourist, this is the Jamaica you'll see, but here's the Jamaica you won't see. And slowly but surely, as this documentary unraveled, it started talking about what we were actually doing in the United States in this country and how we were doing this to countries, especially in South America and around the world. And I was just astonished, like, oh my goodness. And just to let you know, some years back, we actually had John Perkins, if you may know the name, author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And he stepped out and says, this is what I was paid by the government to do, which is to go out and create these infrastructure projects in these countries, say like a Jamaica or Venezuela, Ecuador, whatever the case is, and loan them money they knew they couldn't pay back. And that was so they could exploit both their labor pool for cheap prices as well as their natural resources. In other words, come to just take them over and own them. And as you start, for instance, going back to the days of hearing George H.W. Bush, we only seek peace while we're destroying your country, of course, and you realize what's really going on underneath there. As an American, you can understand why countries around the world were frustrated with us.
Oh,
you know, and so when I hear and read what you were talking about, just to give people some insight about this Puerto Rican energy company, they were claiming they were buying top-grade oil to produce energy because somewhere right around 80 or 90% of their energy was produced through oil, burning oil. But they were actually getting the sludge oil for, pennies on the dollar for to look at it that way. But yet charging, it's sort of like charging somebody for a Maserati even though they're only going to get a Volkswagen. You wonder, where's the rest of that money going? But it begins to make sense. This isn't a conspiracy. It's like when you go back to the days, for instance, of Richard Nixon and the whole Watergate scandal, and you have the secret source known as Deep Throat says, all you got to do is follow the money, and the politics just all disappear. And it becomes reasonable to look at it that way. And you did that because of your years in banking. You knew how to look at this and ask questions from a perspective of somebody, as you said, who used to loan. Let's go ahead and talk about that process and how this really opened the doors, which would be different for people who didn't have that kind of background like you did.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Yes, we followed the invoices to Venezuela, where they cut a deal with Hugo Chavez and his henchmen, and they created a fictitious oil sales production company that would purchase toxic crude oil, not only from Venezuela but other countries, and ship it to Puerto Rico. And then in Puerto Rico, they would bribe owners of testing labs to test the oil and claim it was high grade. And once that took place, the payment was distributed to the this fictitious or front company in Venezuela, where it was laundered into many other companies, and then it finds its way back to politicians, typically family members of politicians and policing officials in Puerto Rico and the United States. And all this information was given to the FBI many times, and not only by me, but by the CIA and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Justice refused to investigate or prosecute. And they worked out a system that's pretty slick. Chuck Schumer can be seen as the godfather of this long-running protection racket that's being run out of the Senate to raise campaign contributions. And what he did, he made a deal with Eric Holder and President Obama that all securities-related or Wall Street-related criminal activity will flow through the Southern District of New York, where Chuck Schumer exclusively picked the Attorney General and his henchmen that work in the Southern District of New York. In fact, during the biggest years of fraud, although it's continuing today, that took place, he hired his former personal attorney to be the Attorney General of the Southern District of New York. And over his tenure, he never prosecuted one single person that was involved with all this criminal activity. The cases would come, criminal complaints would come in, and he would bury them.
And I know that a lot of people listening to this, their first reaction, like anybody does, especially if you're not really initiated into this, and I'm still pretty much a rookie, but boy, am I learning fast. And that is, why don't they do that? But here's another way you can look at this whole thing, too. On our program, some of the cornerstones we talk about are, for instance, health. And when you take a look at cancer as an industry and how there has been a cure for cancer since the 1920s, people say, really? I even had actress Suzanne Sommer say that to me. She says, really, where, when? And I said, really? You got to be kidding me. This has been around. This is how you defeat a cancer cell. It's pretty straightforward. And yet she says, I've never lent my name to a lot of these raise money for cancer awareness and research because the biggest reason, nobody knows where this money really goes. And she says, think about how long cancer research has been around, and the money that's been raised has been millions of dollars over the course of 50 years, and we're still no closer to a cure for cancer than we were when we began. And you think, well, there's a reason behind that. Why would a bureaucracy want to give away give up free money? I understand that even Jerry Lewis discovered, and I don't know how true this is, that there was a cure for muscular dystrophy. And when he found this out, he went to the association that he was raising all this money through his years of telethoning, and apparently they fired him. But why would you give this money up? And so when it comes to why haven't people been prosecuted or held to account, well, because everybody's on the take of free money. And that's pretty much what you discovered what was going on, correct?
Yeah, it is. And, I even took this directly to President Trump, and he's actually in my book, where I name over 200 politicians and tell you what criminal offenses they committed. And President Trump's response was, what can I do? Everyone is involved. Meaning that if he tries to take this on, he's going to lose the support of Republican and Democratic senators because they're all benefiting from this. And there's no one in the Department of Justice that's going to support a proper investigation or prosecution because they were appointed by the very same senators who are extorting or extorting money from these companies or accepting the bribes. Because it's so big that, it would ruin me.
Right. And you can see how when you hear about the so-called swamp is not only deep, but it's wide, and you have to, and I'm sure listeners out there are wondering, is there something that can be done? Anything?
Yeah, it's insane. During my research, and there's a ton of it in the book, and I hope people read it. And by the way, I named over 200 government officials, and I told you what crimes they committed, and I have not been sued by anybody. I have not received any legal notifications. Nobody's denying it. They're simply just not talking about it. And I sent each one of those people that I accused of criminal acts a copy of the book. So that tells you something. But one of the interesting things in the book tells you how despicable these people are. Elizabeth Warren, for instance, says, well, I'm going to get Wall Street. I'm going to teach them a lesson. I'm a pro-person. I'm a pro-citizen person and an anti-Wall Street person, and we're going to put an end to all the corrupt activity on Wall Street. Well, when she ran for president, she knowingly took $2.5 million of the stolen money for her campaign.
Now, here's an area that I would like to talk about, how this also directly affects Americans, especially when it comes to people who are retiring, who have become involved when buying government bonds and the like. Let's go ahead and talk about that, because I remember years ago I had an investment advisor say, if you want to go ahead and start out safe and secure, go ahead and invest in government bonds, and explains how these things work. It's basically IOUs, so they can borrow money from you for projects. And I said, well, why would I trust the government and feel safe with them? They can't even seem to handle money on their own, much less they're going to worry about mine. The worst thing you can do is turn over control, of course, of your money to someone else and not do your homework. But let's talk about how this really affects, call it the low retired American worker, for instance.
Daniel, bingo. Thank you so much.
Because this here was ugly. You see the low-hanging fruit from the bonds. I'm like thinking, there's extortion right there in your face, and you would have never thought about something like that. But let's go ahead and talk about that, because I think this is really important.
Well, what makes this the perfect crime is that, in general terms, no one person is overly impacted by this criminal act.
Yeah, it isn't like Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme, which is what all this is anyway. Wow.
Exactly. It is, and it's exactly like Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. But what makes it frustrating is the typical bondholder is not rich, is not living in Beverly Hills. The typical bondholder has $2,500 of double tax-free municipal bond from the state of Iowa on a bridge project, or from the Puerto Rico utility company, and that $2,500 might represent 30, 40, 50% of their retirement savings, and they buy the double tax-free bonds because it makes sense to earn the tax-free interest so it doesn't impact their Social Security payments. And most of these people don't understand how Wall Street works. They don't even know what a bond is. But their broker at Fidelity or Merrill Lynch said, hey, why keep your money in a savings account or a CD and earn 3% taxable when I can give you 2.5% tax-free? And our bonds are rated AAA or AA. So the investor says, hey, that makes sense, and he buys the bond. And then when it goes bad, or they default on the bond, there's not much he can do, because he doesn't have millions of dollars to sue anybody. And even if he did, he never understood how Wall Street worked and what took place behind the scenes that made those bonds fraudulent the day he bought them. And one of the things that encourages this kind of behavior and allows it to happen so frequently is the fact that Moody's, Standard & Poor's Global, and Fitch have a monopoly on credit ratings for bonds. They control or issue 90% of the credit ratings for bonds across the United States. And for the right fee, they'll issue a good rating on a fraudulent bond. And in their mind, it's okay because, like the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, the municipal company, the municipal entity, Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority or somebody else, will refinance those bonds before they default. So they get all this incredible fee income, and they get to reissue new ratings on the frequently refinanced bonds, and they're being frequently refinanced because they have to be paid off by new money because they have no ability to pay them off themselves. So it's a Ponzi scheme identical to Bernie Madoff, only on a much larger scale. And the three credit rating agencies are fully participating, and they have the complete and total protection of the Department of Justice and our most senior politicians.
And that was another interesting, I think, a fascinating part, because people would say, well, how are they getting away with all of this? And you can see how it works. When you talk about rating companies, let's say that you think of the typical three that most consumers know of, and that's Experian and TransUnion and Equifax. And so their credit ratings is pretty important if you want credit extended to, whether it's to buy a house or you want to buy a newer car, just have a credit card so you have emergency funds just in case. Well, you've got a credit rating. People understand this. But what happens when you're in a position, if you've been a poor creditor or creditee, however you want to put it, and you can get any one of these three companies, if not all of them, when you pay them enough money, if somehow you just happen to have a pile of money, to say, can you go ahead and give me a 5-star credit rating so I can get access to credit that I won't probably ever pay back? And that's exactly what's happening here, but this is in the millions and even billions of dollars, correct?
Trillions of dollars.
Trillions of dollars. There you go. I forgot to get up to the T level of things here.
Well, Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority issued $10 billion alone of completely unsupportable municipal bond debt that received triple B plus ratings from the three agencies, and every single party involved in this process knew Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority was technically bankrupt. And we have sworn testimony from Big Six accounting firms that acknowledge this. And we have sworn testimony from municipal executives who say that the credit rating agencies that issued the credit ratings and the banks that sold the bonds were fully aware of the fact that the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority was bankrupt when these bonds were issued. And that was all offered to the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then the investigations were squashed by people like Chuck Schumer, going to their political appointees and saying, don't let this go any further.
So it doesn't look like anything's really going to move forward at all in all this.
No, I had a senior attorney from the Securities and Exchange Commission that gave me some hope for a while, Sue Curtin. She was the senior prosecutor for the Securities and Exchange Commission. But the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission is a corrupt political ally of Chuck Schumer and others. And he received a call to kill it, and he went back to the senior attorney and told her to squash the whole investigation. In conversations with me, she said this is the most compelling piece of securities fraud that I have ever seen. It is widespread, and it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and your evidence is overwhelming.
And the simple solution a lot of people would think is, well, don't vote these people back into office, but it's just, the web is just too big, it seems like.
Yes, and they all track to the same swamp. You know, in public, Republicans and Democrats hate each other, but in private, they're high-fiving each other over this. They're distracting us with all this nonsense where they're robbing us blind.
I don't know how many times I've told or suggested to people, it really doesn't matter who's president of the United States. It's like that song by Talking Heads where it's the same as it ever was.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. At least Trump was honest with me, and he said, what am I going to do? Every senator and congressman relies on this stolen money to get reelected because 91% of the time, the politician with the most money will win the election. So the politicians recognize that, and they're running this mafia-style protection racket, and it's become their number one funding source over the last decade.
I know one of the fascinating, paradoxes with this whole COVID-19 and the burning of the cities that is going on in places like, of course, Chicago, New York, and Portland, where I actually moved away from 3 years ago, is people are saying, well, what's going on here that these governors and mayors aren't doing anything? I said, because they're waiting for the big kickback from this HEROES Act. And they got confused for a minute, like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, these Democrats, they passed this House passing of the HEROES Act for $3 trillion. Where do you think that money's going? Sure, the American worker may get an extension of their unemployment benefits because that there is the candy. But the fact of the matter is there's a couple of $1 trillion there that these mayors and governors are sitting back, letting their cities burn, not offering any protection, trying to get involved with, for instance, the protesting that allegedly has been going on that's turned to violence. And they're going to get that funding from the government, should this have passed, to rebuild their cities that they let burn. But most of it won't even go to the direction that's supposed to go to, much like the teachers union. They get all this federal funding. They didn't want the kids back in school, but they wanted the money that the federal supplies for, of course, these public schools. And Trump's like, well, forget about that. If the kid ain't going to be in class, we'll just give them the money directly. And apparently the teachers union had a problem with that too. But you see all this, and there's just such a myriad of ways that the government that's supposed to be by the people, for the people, to serve people, has actually done nothing but serve themselves. And boy, I know that you went through the ringer yourself. How has your life been? I'm sure this profoundly changed everything for you. How do you see things for yourself this day and age?
I've really become, unfortunately, a bit of a cynic. I mean, I was very pro-American, very pro-government until I was exposed to all this, and I'm shocked at the level of corruption and the number of people who freely admit they're involved in all this, and that it's too big and it's too out of control for anybody to interfere with. And I'm shocked. I mean, it's hard enough to start a company of your own, but it's impossible when you have to deal with government fraud. They're just too big and too powerful. And they leave you with no protection because they control the legal mechanisms that could stop this.
And as we've been saying, it's funny because all the evidence is really blatantly right in front of you about all this. You take a look at, for instance, 9/11. Well, it just so happens Halliburton, which was a company that Dick Cheney was a CEO of, who had to relinquish that title to be vice president of the United States. Who do you think the war contracts went to?
Yeah.
It's like, guys, it's right here in front of you, so you can't say this is a conspiracy. It's right there. And what's funny is they're all looking at us and laughing like, so what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, you're powerless. You're powerless, and you're meaningless to us. I don't even have to pay attention to my constituency anymore because I'm getting my campaign funded from all this criminal activity.
Boy, do you have any suggestions for the listeners out there?
Just don't stop reelecting the same people. I mean, I can't believe how stupid the people of New York are, where they just consistently reelect Chuck Schumer when he spends all his energy and time trying to help Wall Street steal their money. And the evidence is overwhelming, and there's been newspaper articles written about it, but they're so obsessed with this Democrat versus Republican thing, they rather have a bad Democrat than a good Republican than a good Republican. And it's worked in their favor. I mean, they orchestrated this whole us against them thing. And, the position now most people have is, yeah, my politician may be a rapist and a murderer, but at least he's not a child molester.
sometimes you have to wonder about that too.
You know what I mean? Just like I'll take any, because I cannot be against a Republican. I can't pick a Republican, or I can't pick a Democrat. So I'll have to vote for the bad Republican. And they make it so hard for any outsider to run, and that's why Trump is being attacked from all sides. I mean, he picked his allegiance with the Republicans, but it's tentative.
Right.
Because
that's what I tell people, too. I mean, he had to choose a side to run, but I don't think he's either of them. He's just a guy who is a businessman. And,
right.
Trying to run government like, you try to run a good business, but seems to be having a lot of trouble with that as well.
And a lot of people just want to get rid of him because he's a threat to the status quo, which allows them to rob the American people blind.
And it's funny, too, because I've asked about that. I could never really understand the hatred for Donald Trump from a lot of people. We're talking street-level, everyday people. And the most consistent answer I get about him is, well, his personality is crude and he seems to be a racist. Really, but do you pay attention to any policies this man's involved in? And most people really aren't aware of anything he's done. So, okay, well, then that's where we are then. Okay, what do you do?
Yeah, it's sad and hopeless. It gives me a feeling of hopelessness from time to time, but I still keep fighting the good fight. I mean, I wrote 50 newspaper articles about pieces of all this corruption, and I got printed. What no one will print is the full story of how it all connects together and who the mafia leaders are within our government.
I'm sure the mafia is all scratching their head now thinking, why didn't we think of all this?
Oh, my God, it's genius.
Yeah, get yourself elected, into politics. Then you've got access to the power and the decisions through the legislature, through the judicial department and the executive branch. Start building your income, and pretty soon you're untouchable. I know that I, some years back, had interviewed with a former U.S. Attorney General who was involved in actually the slow deconstruction of the mafia. And then he moved from there, he says, but the hardest crimes to really deconstruct and tear down were those white-collar crimes. He says, because when you take a look at the mafia, for instance, a lot of these people were gangsters, raised from the street level. And they knew they were in a life of crime, so they knew that potentially they would end up in jail. And as a result, they would actually turn and flip on others to lighten their sentences. And it was easy to do that, as he would say. It was easy to turn these people. But he says when they began to go after Enron, he says that was a much different story. He says these were white-collar people who were established and respected in their communities, who didn't expect to go to jail for what they were doing. So they weren't turning on anybody. But yet, here's the ultimate gangster right here that doesn't care, because who are you going to turn to? What are you going to do about it? And it's like you said, it's easy to become slightly cynical, but at least, for instance, in your world, and I would like to say in mine, at least let's get a conversation going about this, and everybody can do something.
Well, I'll tell the story. I took all this information and shared it with the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And one of the three executive editors actually called me and said, Rich, I believe every word that you have printed here, and the support that the evidentiary documents you sent us support what you're claiming, and it would make a phenomenal story. But it would also destroy this newspaper. I cannot take on the federal government, nor will I.
Well, Richard, first of all, I want to thank you for the courage to bring all this up. And again, I'm about a third of the way through the book, and excited. I mean, it's amazing how you just keep turning the pages in this. I've really been enjoying this quite a bit. What would you like to leave our listeners with today that may seem encouraging?
That the only way to make this different, to change things, is to get involved. And I would encourage everyone to pay closer attention to what their politicians are actually doing and not what they're saying, and to take their voting seriously. And if you need to vote for a Democrat or a Republican that's not your party to get rid of a corrupt official, pay the price, do it. I'd rather have an honest person in there with slightly different political views than a corrupt person who's going to continue the status quo until there's nothing left to steal.
Now, how can people find your book, Capitol Hill's Criminal Underground?
Capitol Hill's Criminal Underground is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble online. It's easily attainable, 2-day shipping. And I encourage you to look there. I'm also on YouTube, where I gave a 60-minute testimony to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI back in 2016 about all this criminal activity. They showed up and were in the audience taking diligent notes, only to call me later to tell me they're not going to be allowed to follow through on this. And that video, there's a video of that testimony on YouTube under commercial solar power.
Yeah, I tried looking you up this morning to see if there was any YouTube, and all I seen was a very brief sort of advertisement of the book.
Now, there's actually a 60-minute, and there's a link in my book that takes you there.
Okay.
There's a 60-minute called Commercial Solar Power Press Conference, and it's a videotape of my 60 minutes of testimony that lay out in detail how they conduct all this criminal activity and where the money goes and who's getting paid. And in the audience were senior Securities and Exchange lawyers and FBI lawyers, and they were all flabbergasted at the end of the testimony. And they said they'd get back to me. Some of them did, and they said pretty much that they're not going to be allowed to pursue this.
And I know, too, as I looked on Amazon, you do have a 72% 5-star rating on this. So, folks, get out there, at least get your eyes open, and then decide what next steps you're going to take to see if there's a time we can get this all balanced out and the government back to what it's supposed to be doing.
I took a lot of death threats for you, for the public on this book, and it required me to change my lifestyle quite a bit. So I hope your readers get something out of it. I think they'll be shocked at the simplicity of this criminal operation and how they're pulling it off.
Richard, thank you again for being on the Beyond 50 radio program. It's been a pleasure.
Really enjoyed my time with you and your listeners. Thank you again.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thanks for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, wherever you are is where you should be. Have a great day.
Thank you.